There are quite a few different selection tools here in Photoshop's toolbar, as well as some selection methods here in the Select menu. I'll give you some hints about which to use when as we go through this chapter, but no matter which selection method you're using at the moment, you need to know how to add to, subtract from, and invert a selection. So let's make a selection so I can show you those. Here in the Select menu, I'm going to choose Subject. Select Subject is an automatic way to have Photoshop select the main objects in an image, in this case, the birds. If you look closely, you'll see that Photoshop also selected some of the branch, and that isn't what I wanted. So let's talk about how to remove those areas from a selection and how to add in areas that Photoshop might have missed. I see a little bit of the bird here that isn't selected. I'll zoom in so you can get a better look at that. Let's start by subtracting this tiny area of the background from this selection. For little bits like this, I'll sometimes use the lasso tool, which is located here in the toolbar. By the way, there are multiple selection tools behind each one that you see on the face of the toolbar, so remember to always press down and take a look at the flyout menu to make sure you've got the tool that you want. There are two ways to activate subtracting from a selection, and one is to go to the options bar and click a button. The other is to use a keyboard shortcut. Just so you know they're there, I'll show you the buttons. For this tool and some of the other selection tools, there are 4 buttons right at the beginning of the options bar that look like this. And the third one, the solid square with the outline square in front of it, is the subtract from selection icon. So you could click on that and then go about subtracting bits you don't want. The one to the left of it with the 2 solid squares is the add to selection icon. But honestly, you're going to want to do this with keyboard shortcuts because as you'll see, there's a lot of switching between adding to and subtracting from a selection. So try to remember this. If you want to subtract from a selection, like right down here, press and hold the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows. And then, with the lasso tool, you can just lasso or drag around the area you want to subtract. And I said I wanted to subtract this little area too. So we'll get that one. Now, if you wanted to add to the selection, for example, up here, as I said, hold down the Shift key and then drag along that edge and around and back to the beginning, and that adds the blue feathers to our selection of the birds. So the lasso tool isn't the only tool that has this ability. The other tools do also. So let's take another tool to finish cleaning up this selection, which is the quick selection tool. You may not see this on the face of your toolbar, so click and hold in this tool slot and choose quick selection tool from the flyout menu. You can ignore the pink outline. It's part of the object selection tool. We'll learn about that later. Now we have the quick selection tool selected. And if you go up to the options bar for this tool, you'll see that its add to and subtract from icons look a little different, but they do the same thing. And we can use the same keyboard shortcut. So what do we want to do? We want to subtract this area from the selection. And I may want to make my brush cursor a little smaller, so I'm going to press the left bracket key on my keyboard a couple of times. That's the key to the right of the P key on US keyboards. So now I'll hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows and just go like this and remove that little bit of the branch. Great, now let's go over and do the same thing over here. Hold down the Option or Alt key and drag over this area. And if the tool goes too far and subtracts some of the bird, just hold down Shift to switch to Add to Selection and try to get that little bit. And sometimes you have to go back and forth quite a few times between subtracting from the selection and adding to the selection to get things just right, and you can do that with those keyboard shortcuts. Now I'd like to show you one more thing, which is how to invert a selection. So I'm going to go back to the full screen view. Sometimes, like here, it's easier to select the opposite of what you really want. So in this case, I would really like to do something to change the background, not the birds. but it was just easier to select the birds. So what we need to do now is invert this selection. To do that, go up to the Select menu and choose Inverse. Now, the background is selected and not the birds. So if I make a change, like turning everything black and white, only the background will be impacted. I'll go to the Image menu, I'll choose Adjustments and Black and White, and click OK. The birds are in color, everything in the background is black and white. That's exactly what I was going for. And the last thing to remember is that if your marching ants or your selection outline is still showing when you're finished, you need to deselect. You can go to the Select menu and choose Deselect, but there's a keyboard shortcut for that too, and it's another one worth remembering because you'll use it often, and that is Command D on the Mac or Control D on Windows to deselect. So that's how to add to a selection, subtract from a selection, and invert a selection when you're working with any of the selection tools here in Photoshop.